I recently sat down for coffee with an old friend, a senior architect who has spent 20 years designing the skylines of major cities. By every traditional metric, he is a success story.
Right. Top of his field.
Absolutely. But as we sat there, he wasn't talking about his latest project. He was showing me a budgeting app on his phone with this focused intensity of a man diffusing a bomb.
Wow.
He had just received a significant annual raise, yet he was explaining with a sort of quiet, bewildered shame why he had decided to cancel his family's summer vacation and switch to a discount grocer.
Even with a raise.
Even with a raise. He said, "The news says inflation is back in the target range." He whispered it, glancing at a news ticker on the wall. "The reports say the economy is resilient. But when I look at my insurance premiums, my grocery receipts, and my kids' tuition, those reports feel like they're written about a different planet."
That hits home for a lot of people.
Yeah, it really does. He looked at me, searching for an explanation that his bank statement couldn't provide. He was doing everything right. Saving, working late, investing, yet he felt like he was running up a down escalator that was gradually picking up speed.
The down escalator, that's a perfect metaphor.
He was earning more units of currency than ever before, but his world was visibly shrinking. What struck me most was his sense of institutional alienation. To him, the official statistics weren't just inaccurate. They felt like a form of strategic gaslighting. He was experiencing a profound dissonance. Yeah. His nominal wealth was at an all-time high, but his actual security was in a documented retreat. This disconnect, this jagged fracture between the polished macro narrative of the state and the exhausting micro-reality of the individual is the first sign of a dying social contract.
Yeah.
We are told the basket of goods is stable, but that basket has been carefully curated to exclude the very pillars that support a middle-class life. We are witnessing the result of a systemic siphon that rewards the leveraged speculator while quietly liquidating the saver. To understand why the world feels so expensive when the charts say it isn't, we have to look past the CPI lie and into the mechanics of a global wealth transfer occurring in plain sight. Okay, so let's unpack this. I mean, that anecdote is just a masterclass in describing the feeling of modern life, isn't it?
It really is.
You have this highly productive, incredibly successful person, a senior architect, and he's experiencing a documented retreat in his actual security. His real quality of life is going down, even as his paycheck is going up.
And he's doing everything the system asked of him. He's playing by the rules, working hard, saving, investing, all of it.
Yet he feels like he's losing, running up that down escalator. So the problem isn't just, financial, it's existential.
The feeling of institutional alienation, that
Yeah.
financial exhaustion. That's really the central theme of this deep dive today.
Okay.
Our mission really is to connect that jagged fracture you mentioned.
Right.
The gap between the big macro narrative from the government and the media and the micro reality of paying your bills.
The day-to-day grind.
Exactly. And we aren't just looking at the architect's bank statement. We're going to track how this chronic affordability anxiety translates into real psychological distress.
And then into our relationships.
Crucially, how it destabilizes the smallest, most important unit of our whole social ecosystem, the family, personal relationships.
So we're really moving from a discussion about currency units to a discussion of emotional currency. And that's where the real insight is, I think. So many people feel this exhaustion, this shame even over not being able to achieve what their parents achieved at the same income level or even a lower one.
It's a widespread feeling.
So if the macroeconomy is forcing individuals into this state of chronic anxiety, how does that strain actually play out, in our own heads and in our most intimate relationships?
Well, to really get it, we first have to understand how the modern psyche is built, or maybe a better way to put it, is how it's been unbuilt over the past, say, 70 years. Yeah. This structural shift is absolutely necessary context for the personal crisis that your friend, the architect, is feeling.
Okay, so where do we start?
We have to trace this really fundamental shift. We can look to what psychoanalysts define as this foundational break in Western collective life that started around the middle of the 20th century.
And what's that?
It's something the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan summarized as the evaporation of the father.
Okay, the evaporation of the father. Now, when we talk about that, we're not talking about, literal dads leaving home, though that's a whole other topic. This is more of a symbolic shift, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's symbolic. What the father represented in that old social contract has faded.
So what did it represent? What's been lost?
It represented the whole patriarchal social model. A model that was centered on things like law, limits, sacrifice, and duty.
Okay.
The father, in this symbolic context, was the symbol of prohibition, the source of the structural law that enforced boundaries and created order.
So life's focus was external and collective.
Totally. It was all about duty. Duty to God, duty to your country, to your family, to the community. You measured your worth against these external, often very rigid moral codes.
And when that powerful symbol of external law evaporates, as you say, that space doesn't just stay empty, right? Something has to fill it.
It doesn't stay empty for a second. According to sociologists like Zygmunt Bauman and others, that space becomes immediately occupied by the individual self.
A self with a capital S.
Right. And the entire pivot of society shifts. It moves away from collective duty and towards self-realization.
So the highest moral goal is no longer serving the community, but fulfilling your own potential.
That's it. It overrides everything. It overrides the constraints of collective duty, even the sacrifices you might need to make for your community to be stable. The goal isn't to be a good citizen anymore.
What is it then?
The goal is to be a successful, actualized, and importantly, a visible individual.
Wow. Okay, so that immediately suggests a massive shift in what causes people psychological pain. I mean, if the goal is following the law and your duty, then the main problem is breaking the law.
Right.
But if the goal is self-realization, the problem is failing to be realized.
Yeah.
Failing to become that successful individual.
Exactly. And this leads to a fundamental change in the symptomatic picture that people present when they're in distress. Early psychoanalysis, the Freudian stuff, it dealt primarily with what we might call the guilty man.
The guilty man.
Yeah. Their central struggle was moral conflict. It was this battle between their raw, primal drives, what Freud called the id, and the powerful, internalized moral expectations of society, the superego.
The superego. That's that little police officer in your head, the inner critic.
The internal police officer is a great way to put it. It was built by internalizing all that external law. The struggle was all intrapsychic moral drama playing out inside your own head.
So you're constantly measuring yourself, your impulses versus your duties.
Precisely. And that leads to this profound, sometimes crippling emotion of guilt. The patient in, say, 1920 would come in and say, I feel terrible because I broke the rules, or I feel terrible because I wanted to break the rules. Guilt is about having done something wrong.
Okay, but something changed.
A huge change. Starting around the 1950s, 60s, therapists began seeing a totally different kind of patient. He was famously identified by Heinz Kohut as the tragic man.
The tragic man. From guilty man to tragic man.
And these individuals, they weren't complaining about moral conflict or guilt. Their complaints were centered on this chronic emptiness, a profound sense of meaninglessness, and deep, deep personal insecurity.
So the suffering shifted.
It shifted entirely.
Yes.
From a problem with one's morality to a problem with one's self-esteem, one's fulfillment, one's identity. The whole personality was organized around what they call a narcissistic economy.
Let me see if I can translate that for you listening. So the guilty man, he would ask himself, did I break the law?
Yes.
But the tragic man asks, am I enough? Am I visible? Is my life meaningful?
That's the core of it.
And those seem like much harder questions to answer.
They are, because they demand constant validation from the outside.
Yeah.
And the roots of this shift, they go all the way back to how we're educated, how we're socialized. We have to look at the crisis of the superego.
Okay.
So in the old educational model, we're talking pre-1950s, the child was viewed through this Freudian lens of the perverse polymorph.
That's some very technical language.
Right.
What does perverse polymorph actually imply about how they saw a child?
It basically means the child was seen as this creature dominated by raw, unorganized drives. Sexual drives, aggressive drives. They weren't seen as innocent.
So these drives needed to be tamed.
Formed, constrained,
Yeah.
structured. And that happened through external rules, limits, and yes, sometimes punishment. This forced renunciation of your immediate selfish desires, that struggle, that resistance, is precisely what builds a rigid, powerful superego.
So it was a formation process based on conflict.
Yes, and that led to that internal drama of guilt as you wrestled with your own internalized constraints.
But today, that model is, we'd call that harsh, maybe even barbaric. How did the modern educational model flip that on its head?
It's a complete inversion. The modern model often operates on the assumption that the child is naturally innocent.
Okay.
Their desires aren't seen as impulses that need taming or social shaping. They're viewed as rights that have to be protected and fostered. You have to shield them from anything normative. from limits that might cause frustration or, God forbid, an injury to their self-esteem.
So the focus is entirely on individual realization, on success, on maximizing potential.
And any rule that forces you to renounce a desire is seen as an obstacle to your natural development. It's condemned.
So if you remove the resistance that's necessary to build that superego, if you avoid all the conflict, you naturally weaken the whole moral structure that produces guilt.
You do.
So if guilt retreats, what steps forward? What defines the central emotion of psychological distress now?
It's shame. This is the absolutely crucial distinction. If you want to understand the modern malaise, you have to understand the difference between guilt and shame.
Okay, so break it down. Guilt versus shame.
Guilt is an internal judgment. I feel bad because I did something wrong. It's about an action.
Right.
Shame, by contrast, is associated with the conflict between the ego, who I perceive myself to be, and the ego ideal, who I should be. It's generated by the perception of an external evaluation.
So it's not I feel bad, it's I am considered bad or inadequate.
Exactly. I am inadequate to the context. The pressure moves from your internal moral law to the external performative evaluation of others.
So the strict father is replaced by what?
He's replaced by the despotism of cultural stereotypes. These are the images promoted incessantly by mass media, by social media, by marketing, by the entire internet.
The flawless model.
Flawless models that just colonize our collective imagination. They're constantly highlighting the difference between the glorious, successful, wealthy, beautiful image you should be
and the reality you see in your own life, in your bank account, in your job.
Yes. That makes the anxiety inherently public and performative. The architect you mentioned, showing you his budgeting app with that bewildered shame, that's a perfect demonstration.
Yeah, that's it. He's not ashamed because he broke a moral law.
No.
He's ashamed because his reality, canceling a vacation, switching to a discount grocer, is failing to live up to the ego ideal that's expected of a senior architect.
And that anxiety of being unmasked as inadequate or mediocre, it's profound.
It must be.
And that shame immediately generates a symmetrical emotion. Envy. You start to envy those who seem to embody that ideal so effortlessly, the people who don't appear to suffer from these shortcomings.
So modern suffering isn't about moral conflict anymore.
Not primarily. It's defined by the relentless external pressure to conform to a standard that feels, for more and more people, increasingly unattainable.
So, okay, this cultural narcissism is born out of that environment, this relentless external pressure and this internalized shame. And we often use the word narcissism just to mean, someone's vain or selfish.
Right, the colloquial use.
But here in this academic psychology context, we're talking about a structural defense mechanism. So how does this defensive grandiosity actually manifest itself?
Well, the contemporary psychological malaise is characterized by an obsession with independence and autonomy. But paradoxically, that's coupled with the progressive deterioration of true, meaningful interpersonal ties.
So we're more focused on being independent, but we're more alone.
Exactly. Sociologists like Bauman noted that individuals are continuously striving to adhere to what he called the performance principle.
The performance principle.
It's the continuous effort to increase one's reputation, one's visibility, one's achievement in what is now often called the performance society.
This sounds exactly like the architect's life. I mean, it's a commitment to peak performance, designing skylines, while at the very same time, he's feeling this profound internal collapse.
That is the core insight, this intense outward manifestation of grandiosity. Strength, freedom, absolute performative capacity, visibility. It's not vanity in the common sense.
So what is it?
It possesses a powerful defensive function. It's a psychological shield, a wall that we build to protect ourselves against these deeply rooted depressive tendencies, this intense shame, this lack of self-esteem, this corrosive envy.
So it's a constant back and forth. The inflated self you show the world is just there to protect you from collapsing on the inside.
That dialectic is the absolute hallmark of narcissistic pathology.
Can you give us an example of how this defense plays out, maybe in the modern professional world?
A classic illustration is the imposter phenomenon. It was initially documented in highly successful women, but now we recognize it's widespread across all high-achieving populations.
Right, the feeling that you're a fraud and you're about to be found out.
It's that constant visceral fear of a narcissistic wound. The fear that at any moment, the success or competence you perform externally will be stripped away, and it'll reveal your fundamental inadequacy, your intellectual fraudulence.
So the performance, the constant striving for external validation, it's just a desperate shield.
It is. And it requires a massive amount of energy to maintain that shield.
And that energy drain, that brings us right back to the exhaustion felt by the architect. He's running up that down escalator, performing his success while budgeting for discount groceries, terrified of that mask slipping. This is where Christopher Lasch's thesis on the culture of narcissism becomes so critically relevant, because he connects this psychological defense directly to the economic structure of modern capitalism.
He does. Lasch argued that advanced capitalism systematically dismantled the older social order. It abandoned the overt authoritarianism of the past. Specifically, it traded the constraints of, say, Puritanism and the Protestant work ethic.
Things like delayed gratification, discipline, thrift.
Exactly. It traded all that for sexual and social freedom in what he called the marketplace of sensations.
So we were liberated from the old moral laws, but that liberation was immediately tethered to a new kind of economic authority.
Precisely. Capitalism exchanged the authority of the father, the symbol of moral law, for the authority of advertising, of economic power, of the market itself.
So freedom was redefined.
It was. It's no longer a moral or political capacity. Fundamentally, freedom became a question of consumption. To be free is to be able to consume, to express your unique self through constant acquisition and self-optimization.
That's a really powerful form of control. If the old system relied on guilt to maintain order, what does this new system rely on?
It relies on anxiety and shame. Lasch observed that the modern psychological individual is persecuted by anxiety and not by guilt.
So the need to conform to an internal moral code is replaced by
a desperate, insatiable demand for external approval and recognition. You place your entire center of gravity outside yourself, constantly searching for validation in the eyes of others. This leads to a person who is, in his words, devoured by anxiety and shame, by a general dissatisfaction and intense sense of emptiness.
And the only immediate antidote to that intense feeling of emptiness is the hope, or maybe the expectation, of achieving that glorious, validated image of success.
Success becomes an indispensable expectation. It's necessary just to tolerate what Lasch called the meaningless squalor of an anonymous existence. And this dynamic is just tragically fueled by mass culture, which encourages us to identify only with the celebrity, the winner, the outlier, while at the same time, it fosters contempt or deep dissatisfaction with the average, the middle, the mass.
So if you feel dissatisfied with your social or economic position in this culture, you internalize it completely as a personal failure.
The decline of class consciousness means the structural problem of a stagnant middle class because the individual's private problem of shame and inadequacy.
We have to emphasize the economic context here. That's what makes the psychological defense so widespread and so necessary.
Absolutely. The spread of these highly grandiose cultural images, this demand for relentless affirmation and success, it's occurred historically alongside clear, progressive social impoverishment.
Like what?
A loss of middle-class power, wage stagnation when you adjust for the core costs of living, rising economic precarity in most Western nations.
So the ceiling of cultural expectation, what we're all supposed to achieve, has never been higher. It demands peak performance, grandiosity. But at the same time, the floor of economic stability and opportunity has been systematically lowered.
The contrast is devastating. It creates an insurmountable conflict between what one is called to be, that winning, flawless image, and the actual resources available to you. Less money, fewer opportunities.
So the age of narcissism, then, it's not driven by some inherent self-love or vanity.
No, not at all. It is the defensive grandiosity used to mask the overwhelming shame of what one perceives oneself to be in reality, a perceived failure.
And this psychological stress, it doesn't just stop at the individual level. It must bleed into everything else.
It immediately metastasizes into the primary relational sphere, into our closest relationships.
That's a perfect pivot.
Okay.
So if the system is designed to generate this widespread psychological shame, and that shame requires this exhausting defensive performance, we have to look at how that exhaustion poisons our most intimate relationships. Popular wisdom always says that money problems are the #1 cause of divorce. In fact, you see all these books that say sharing money sparks the most arguments, causes the most confusion. But how accurate is that, really, when you look at the evidence?
Well, to analyze the impact of financial stress, we can use a framework called Levenger's social exchange theory.
Okay.
This theory views marriage not romantically, but as a kind of ongoing social exchange where partners are constantly, if unconsciously, trying to maximize rewards and minimize costs.
So the stability of the relationship, its cohesiveness, depends on 3 things.
The net attractions, so rewards minus costs, the barriers to leaving the relationship, and the availability of attractive alternatives.
So financial problems, which cause all this anxiety and distress, are fundamentally defined as costs. They just reduce the net attraction of the marriage.
Precisely. A financial problem is defined simply as any situation about getting or spending money that causes an individual anxiety or dissatisfaction within the relationship. If the costs rise too high and the barriers are low, the whole thing is undermined.
Let's look at the historical data then. Let's start back when that old patriarchal model, the father figure, was still dominant. Did financial issues rank highly back in, say, the mid-20th century?
They absolutely did,
Yeah.
but with a really critical nuance that was tied to gender roles.
Okay.
Good's influential 1948 study looked at retrospective accounts from divorced mothers, and it revealed that non-support, meaning the husband was an inadequate provider, he wasn't bringing home enough money for basic necessities like food or rent or clothing.
Right.
That was ranked as the #1 reason for divorce. It was cited by a third of all mothers.
33%. Wow.
But complaints about consumption or the mismanagement of money through things like gambling or excessive spending, that ranked much lower. It was 8th, cited by only 20% of mothers.
That distinction is so crucial. In 1948, the toxic thing was the objective failure to provide. It was a structural critique of the male role.
Yes. The failure to meet the fundamental duty of being the breadwinner was paramount.
And did that continue?
For a while. 2 decades later, Levinger's 1966 study, which analyzed couples actively filing for divorce, confirmed this trend. It ranked general financial problems 3rd overall, cited by 37% of wives.
Still pretty high.
Very high. And significantly, Levinger's also found a stark socioeconomic difference. Lower status wives were far more likely to complain about it than middle status wives, which suggests that the objective economic difficulty was still the driving factor.
So financial problems were a major cause, but they were primarily centered on this objective lack of income and the husband's failure to fulfill that traditional provider role. But we know that the 1970s marked a profound societal shift. This is right as that evaporation of the father was accelerating.
And that structural change correlates directly with a decline in the reported importance of financial issues as a primary cause of divorce.
Really? It went down.
By the mid-70s, studies showed women were much less likely to cite financial problems, and researchers attributed this decline to 2 major trends.
Which were?
First, the massive increase in female labor force participation. That gave women financial alternatives and reduced their reliance on a sole male provider. And second, the broader social trend toward egalitarianism in marital expectations.
So when women achieved greater financial independence, the husband's failure as the sole provider mattered less.
It did. And the nature of the marital complaint shifted. It moved toward quality of life issues.
Like emotional connection and fulfillment, the realm of the tragic man we talked about.
Precisely. Financial complaints still mattered deeply. Don't get me wrong. They were still severe costs. But they dropped significantly in the list of primary complaints, often ranking 9th or 10th. They were supplanted by issues of emotional distance and communication.
Okay, now let's jump to the longitudinal data. If you track couples over a long period, what did researchers find when they analyzed predictors of divorce from 1980 to 1992? Does that popular wisdom hold up statistically?
The longitudinal data offers a much more nuanced and frankly counterintuitive answer. They analyzed the cumulative effect of the total number of financial problems that couples reported.
Okay.
And while the total number of problems did indeed increase the likelihood of divorce, statistically, this factor only explained a tiny amount of the variability, less than 2% of the variance in divorce outcomes.
Wait, less than 2%? That's shocking. I mean, that runs directly counter to this idea that money is the #1 cause of divorce.
It does.
It suggests that financial strain alone, just the fact of having problems, is not a robust statistical predictor of actually getting divorced.
However, the most important single predictor they tested wasn't related to the objective level of income. It was related to subjective financial management. The complaint that a spouse spends money foolishly or unwisely was highly statistically significant, and it generated the largest correlation coefficient of all the financial problems they looked at.
That is where the shift is clearest. We moved from judging a partner based on their ability to provide, that old non-support complaint, to judging them based on their behavior as a consumer. mismanagement.
Yes.
So why did foolish spending become the defining financial toxicity?
Well, it reflects the rise of that individualistic consumer culture and the narcissistic economy we discussed earlier. In an era where debt is normal and consumption is seen as a form of freedom, financial mismanagement is perceived as a failure of personal character.
So it's a moral failure.
A failure of discipline, of responsibility. It's an internal moral failure in this new context. It's the emotional response to that perceived betrayal of responsibility that's so toxic, much more so than the objective amount of money in the bank.
Right. So if the architect's wife complains about his necessary shift to a discount grocer, the fight isn't really about the money he's saving.
No, it's about the shame. The perceived failure to maintain the expected lifestyle, which his foolish peers might be doing by taking on more debt.
Did the data show any gender differences in whose spending was considered most toxic?
Yes, and the numbers are dramatic. When wives reported that their husbands had spending problems, it increased the odds of divorce by a staggering 187%.
187%.
When husbands reported that their wives had spending problems, it increased the odds by 139%. In both cases, the complaint about foolish spending was a potent predictor. It just reinforces that the subjective issue of financial management and responsibility is a massive cost to the relationship. It just fuels resentment and shame and feelings of disrespect.
Okay, let's go back to Levenger's model for a second, the one that includes barriers. You mentioned a fascinating, really counterintuitive finding about how financial strain can actually act as a barrier to divorce.
This is one of the most compelling insights of the study, and it speaks directly to the reality of your friend the architect running up that down escalator.
Okay.
For the couples they tracked in the early 1980s, the financial situation getting worse was actually negatively correlated with divorce.
Meaning what?
Meaning, when their finances deteriorated, the probability of them getting a divorce actually decreased.
That seems absolutely backwards until you think about the transaction costs of leaving.
Exactly. Divorce is an incredibly costly process. You've got legal fees, moving expenses, the immense financial burden of splitting one income stream across two separate households.
So severe financial difficulties can act as a profound barrier.
Yes. It can essentially trap the couple in the marriage because they cannot afford the legal, emotional, or logistical costs of separating.
Yeah.
The relationship is low on rewards, but the barrier is just too high to get over.
That just emphasizes how complex money problems are. They can either fracture a relationship, or if they're severe enough, they can financially imprison the couple within it. Okay, so let's synthesize this. We've established that financial problems are substantially stressors. They impact marital satisfaction for a huge number of people, something like 70%, but they are statistically weak as the single direct cause of divorce.
Right.
And we've also established that this cultural demand for grandiosity creates widespread shame. So how do these two things, the hidden stressor and the psychological defense, how do they merge into the experience of the productive yet struggling individual like the architect?
Well, the first step is to acknowledge the true nature of the conflict. Often, financial arguments are a form of camouflage for deeper unconscious issues.
Camouflage.
Yeah. We can look to Bohannon's concept of emotional divorce. He argued that the legal divorce is often just the final act of a long-established emotional divorce.
So the relationship is already dead, the paperwork is just catching up.
Essentially. And when couples are afraid, or maybe unable, to fight about the real, often unarticulated conflicts, which might involve deep-seated control issues, unmet emotional needs, or this profound sense of identity failure, they displace that conflict onto socially acceptable battlegrounds.
And in our culture, the two most acceptable battlegrounds are money and sex.
They are the weapons used to conduct the emotional war.
So the financial fight becomes the camouflage.
The couple argues fiercely over the budget, or a foolish purchase, and they conclude that the marriage failed over money. But in reality, the budget fight was merely the sanctioned expression of a deeper struggle. Perhaps a struggle over who has control, or the failure of one partner to embody the financial competency demanded by that ego ideal.
The architect's shame is displaced onto the grocery bill, but the real issue is that feeling of existential defeat.
Exactly.
Now, let's tie this displacement and this psychological defense back to the structural economic pressures we talked about in the opening. That systemic siphon that's quietly liquidating the saver.
Because that structural pressure is the foundational fuel for the personal crisis.
Absolutely. The architect's experience, earning more but watching his life shrink, is the direct result of systemic economic forces. Forces that reward leveraged speculation and penalize disciplined saving and production.
We can even name the primary mechanism here. It's often called the Cantillon effect.
The Cantillon effect. Can you break that down?
In simple terms, it means that new money entering the economy isn't neutral. The people and institutions closest to the source of new money, central banks, large financial institutions, get to spend it first before it has caused prices to rise throughout the rest of the economy.
So they get the full purchasing power.
They get the benefit. By the time that money trickles down to the wage earner, the saver, the architect, prices for assets and goods have already been bid up. Their purchasing power has been diluted. It's a hidden tax.
A wealth transfer.
It is a massive systemic wealth transfer. And when the material resources you need for genuine middle class, security, affordable housing, stable retirement, good education are systematically curtailed by these forces, the productive individual feels powerless and inadequate.
And that insecurity maps perfectly onto that shift from guilt to shame.
It does.
This is where we have to address the CPI lie, which the architect felt was strategic gaslighting. If official stats claim the economy is resilient and inflation is benign, but his reality is that he can't afford a vacation, why the disconnect?
Well, the CPI lie refers to the systematic curation of the basket of goods used to calculate the official consumer price index.
Curated how?
The official CPI in many Western countries is designed in a way that it can exclude or downplay the very pillars that support a middle-class life. Specifically, the massive cost increases in non-discretionary critical goods.
Well, it gets left out or minimized.
Historically, costs like housing, education, and healthcare, the three critical expenses that determine your middle-class stability, have been treated very differently in official inflation metrics compared to general substitutable consumer goods.
So if the cost of a television drops by 10%,
that helps offset the fact that your tuition just went up 300%, or your insurance premiums have exploded. The basket is curated to suggest a stability that doesn't exist for most people's core budget. It implies that the economic contract is being upheld.
So if the data is massaged to tell this macro narrative of resilience and stability, but the individual experiences a 50% rise in their three largest costs, they experience what the architect felt.
Profound dissonance, institutional alienation.
The reports feel like they're from another planet.
And this dissonance is absolutely essential to understand. When the nominal success metrics, the architects raise, no longer deliver actual security, like the ability to afford a vacation, it just dissolves the social glue of meritocracy.
It must.
It creates a profound sense of political loneliness among those who still value objective truth and common sense. The system is telling them you are a success, but all the material evidence around them is saying you are losing ground.
And that structural insecurity becomes the foundation for that psychological retreat into defensive narcissism.
The economic reality generates overwhelming shame. And the culture, through the despotism of its stereotypes, demands that you must be the winning image. Autonomous, flawless, successful.
But the structural reality ensures that fewer and fewer people have the resources to genuinely validate that image.
So the psychological retreat into defensive grandiosity, the desperation to perform perfection, is the only immediate, if completely exhausting, defense available against the shame of failing to keep up.
The constant, relentless pressure on the architect, the need to maintain the performance while he's secretly cutting necessary costs, that's the macrofuel for the modern individual's profound micro-malaise.
It is.
And the struggle is so lonely because the systemic failure has been successfully internalized as a personal character flaw.
So the pursuit of success and external validation, which is what defines cultural narcissism, is becoming an increasingly desperate and energy-intensive defense mechanism against widespread shame and inadequacy. And this psychological phenomenon is directly rooted in an economic reality that offers fewer opportunities and fewer resources, even as the cultural volume of expectation is turned up to impossible levels.
It's a feedback loop.
A terrible one. The systemic siphon that rewards the leveraged speculator while quietly liquidating the saver. It doesn't just result in financial insecurity, it results in the erosion of collective emotional stability, forcing individuals into a lonely, unwinnable battle for validation. This is the high cost of the shrinking life.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If the current societal illness is defensive narcissism, masking this deep-seated shame that's rooted in structural economic failure, then the collective solution cannot be found in more individualism or more self-help or more performative success.
No, it can't.
The only way to alleviate the psychological exhaustion of the individual running up that down escalator is to address the structure of the escalator itself. The failure of the system to deliver on the implicit promise of the social contract is what is currently transforming hardworking, successful individuals into anxious, defensive spectators of their own shrinking lives. So we have to ask whether this economic structure, which seems to thrive on individual anxiety and systemic leverage, is not just inefficient, but actively corrosive to the human spirit.